Hello, I'm Richard Gisbert, and you're at the Listening Post's Military and Media Special. This week, war, Hollywood movies, and getting the story out with more than a little help from the Pentagon. The video war games that are literally putting youngsters on the firing line. We chronicle some other media malpractices when military spin doctors got the better of news organizations.
We're going to remove that regime very shortly.
And recruiting soldiers the Ukrainian way. Propaganda can be defined as an attempt to manipulate public opinion. It's at its most effective when the audience does not know it's being manipulated, and one of the best, glitziest examples of that is when propaganda is delivered on the big screen in the guise of a Hollywood blockbuster. Fans of war movies are probably unaware that the U.S. Army, Navy, Air Force, Marine Corps, Coast Guard, even the Department of Defense itself, have established a beachhead in Hollywood. They occupy an entire floor of a Los Angeles office building. They've infiltrated L.A., and their mission is to work closely with big-time filmmakers. The Listening Post's Salah Khat are now on a thriving, symbiotic relationship, and what both sides, the military and the movie makers, are getting out of it.
For as long as there have been movies, the US government and filmmakers have been collaborating to make films that put their side in the best light. That was certainly the case with Frank Capra, Walt Disney, and the 1942 series, Why We Fight.
The Why We Fight orientation films, fashioned by Hollywood-trained craftsmen.
Hollywood has long loved telling the story of soldiers and war. Whether it be Errol Flynn parachuting into the Japanese-occupied Burmese jungle, or more recently Ben Affleck avenging the attacks on the US Navy at Pearl Harbor. But the role that the real American military plays in helping to craft its depiction in these popular movies is not as open a secret.
The Pentagon has a very cozy relationship with Hollywood that goes back about 50 years. World War II represented a big boon for military Hollywood collaboration. And in fact, each branch of the military has its own entertainment and Hollywood liaison office, including the CIA and Homeland Security now. And most of these are based in Los Angeles to be closer to the image makers.
Josh Rushing, who now works as a reporter for Al Jazeera English, was once one of those liaison officers.
The truth is the military is in Hollywood to try to get the story right in films because it recognizes how powerful Hollywood is in shaping people's perceptions about what the military is and what the military isn't.
But what can Hollywood studios and producers expect in return for giving the military big screen time?
They will get very, very cheap access to military locations. They will get very cheap access to military hardware, which runs the gamut from submarines to tanks to planes. And they will get very, very cheap access, probably sometimes free access to soldiers, to troops, to serve as extras in the film. So it makes sense on a kind of business level to do it because it keeps the cost of the film down.
You can't just go down to your local Army surplus supply shop and pick up these goods. In fact, no matter how much money you have, you can't buy them. The only place you can get them is on loan from the Pentagon's Hollywood Liaison Office.
Yet hardware is not the full extent of this relationship. The Pentagon often provides active duty military personnel for technical consultation, and even to do some of the stunts.
What you get when you have the Department of Defense signs on to the thing is an advisor who comes out and watches and says, no, that's wrong, or this is right. We do want to show what the military does for the country, and we show off what professional people they are, and if we can help to make it a realistic portrait of what we do, then it's to our advantage to assist in a production like this.
That was certainly the case with the film Black Hawk Down, produced by Jerry Bruckheimer, which chronicled the 1993 US raid on Somalia. Shot on location in Morocco, this production used over 100 soldiers to do these action scenes and combat sequences.
When Black Hawk Down came out, Jerry Bruckheimer was invited to the White House, and they had a showing of Black Hawk Down with George W. Bush. So the certain directors are favored because they treat the topic very lovingly.
So who really has creative control over the product? The filmmakers or the Pentagon?
If you are making a film where you submit the script to the military beforehand, you're working with the military throughout production, and then you let the military vet the film at the end before anyone can see it, basically you're making a commercial for the military. There's no two ways about it.
However, both critics and supporters of the US military's role in Hollywood do agree on one thing. Being seen in movies can be both a powerful and cost-effective way for the armed forces to reach potential new recruits.
I feel the need for speed.
Top Gun comes about as close as you can get to an actual Pentagon production without having the Pentagon name on it. This was an enormous commercial success, but it was also an enormous recruiting success. Military recruiters actually set up tables outside of movie theaters all across the country in order to catch folks coming out of this film. This really represented a watershed moment in Hollywood liaison office thinking about the potential for film to act as a recruiting poster.
You can look at a movie like Full Metal Jacket. The first half of the movie by Stanley Kubrick shows how horrific Marine Corps boot camp is and how mean and terrible the drill instructors are. You would think this is some really sadistic stuff. It did tons for Marine Corps recruiting. As a matter of fact, I saw that movie as a teenager and wondered, could I take it? Could I do that?
This cozy relationship has been dubbed the military entertainment complex, or militainment.
I think the sensibility of militainment in media coverage really came about after 9/11, when Karl Rove and other members of the White House met with the important producers and directors in the Hollywood industry and said, help us tell the story of the military to the American people so we can fight this war on terror.
We're certainly seeing a post-9/11 effect on Hollywood filmmaking, not necessarily in films which are literally about the war on terror or about the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan. I mean, I think we're seeing, for example, a film like Transformers. I think we're seeing that transposed by filmmakers who maybe in another era, for example, in Vietnam, would have made a jingoistic film, a pro-military film, this time taking that attitude into a more mainstream commercial niche.
Now, Transformers is a kind of total fantasy, and yet it does paint the US military in a pretty good light, and it has a lot of kind of real loving, almost kind of pornographic shots of state-of-the-art helicopters landing in Qatar.
When I was representing the Marine Corps in Hollywood, the movie Jarhead did come to my office. It did request support, but there were several things in the script that we believed were inaccurate, and so we didn't give it support. I actually said no to supporting that film.
But why don't more people know about what's going on behind the glitz of the silver screen?
The only clue that you're making a commercial to the US military is a tiny little credit line that usually says thanks to the US military that no one's ever going to see. So they're watching it and they don't even know they're watching a commercial.
Hollywood producers are not eager to tell everyone that their films are being influenced by military public relations. I think most people are made queasy by product placement in films. I think they're made even queasier by the thought of government propaganda in films.
I think the military always hides its desire because the American public pride themselves on not being the recipients of propaganda. I think if that were revealed, some of these practices and behind the scenes and the way that imagery is really shaped, I think that the American people would be able to see through it better and be more critical of it.
Salah Khadr reporting, and here's how our Global Village voices see that story.
The media industry, such as news organization and Hollywood, are interconnected with the military establishment in various ways. For decades, media have been powerful instruments of war. Therefore, in the realm of popular culture, we must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence by military organizations.
You've got to remember the US military is an enormous machine that is constantly in need of recruits. And one of the most effective ways of recruiting is to glamorize and dramatize military life. And what movies do very effectively is perform that role for them. During the Second World War, they had some very positive experiences with a lot of semi-propaganda movies which portrayed the military in a very positive light. Then you had a very bruising experience with the Vietnam War, where Hollywood kind of turned on the US military and where it was portrayed in quite a negative light. In the 1980s, Top Gun sort of wrote the book on modern media management.
If you've got something to say about the media and want to be one of our Global Village voices, the best way to reach us is via Facebook or Twitter. Just go on those sites and look for the Listening Post page there. Or you can just email us at listeningpost@aljazeera.net. We'd like to hear from you wherever you are. Time now for some Listening Post military media news bites. Hollywood is finding out that Iraq and Afghanistan war movies are far more popular with critics than movie audiences.
Oh boy.
Catherine Bigelow's The Hurt Locker turned a small profit before cleaning up at the Academy Awards in March. Then it did much better at the box office. Paul Greengrass's Green Zone starred Matt Damon, but it lost money.
I want to know why.
Other war films like Lions for Lambs, Rendition, and Redacted all underachieved at the box office, as did In the Valley of Ella, despite featuring big-name stars Tommy Lee Jones and Charlize Theron. It only grossed $6.5 million in the United States over 6 weeks. Filmmakers may not be feeling war fatigue, but filmgoers certainly seem to be. The military media nexus is not just at work on the silver screen. General Electric, which owns TV networks NBC, MSNBC, and CNBC, also has some major defense interests. As a subcontractor for the U.S. Air Force's flagship Tomahawk and Patriot II missiles, the corporation earns much of its revenue from deals with the Pentagon. This vested interest has regularly thrown up questions about the independence of the news coverage on GE's TV channels. NBC reporters, including the late David Bloom, came under fire for some sanitized and glamorized reporting of the early stages of the Iraq War.
We heard two large whooshes.
But it's not just the reporting of military conflicts that's caused controversy. It's also the credibility of the on-air analysts. In April 2008, the New York Times blew the lid off the Pentagon's spin tactics during the Iraq War when it published documents and minutes of meetings which revealed just how former U.S. military men had been trained by the Pentagon to put out the Bush administration's line. The campaign was implemented by the then Defense Secretary, Donald Rumsfeld, and it involved retired U.S. military personnel who went on American news networks to help sell the war. Going back even earlier, the largely pro-war U.S. media was fed a regular serving of some action heroes by the Pentagon, such as Jessica Lynch and Pat Tillman, whose stories pushed the military's agenda and boosted TV ratings.
The first American prisoner of war to be rescued from hostile territory since World War II.
Lynch's capture in an ambush in Iraq in 2003 was plastered all over the U.S. TV news networks. Although it later transpired that she never actually fired a bullet, Lynch was portrayed as a little girl Rambo.
You're doing great, Jessica.
A year later, GE's NBC broadcast this dramatized and completely inaccurate version of her story. Lynch's fellow pawn in the propaganda war was football player turned soldier Pat Tillman. Initial reports claimed that the all-American action hero had been gunned down in Afghanistan in 2004 by the Taliban, but it soon became clear that he had died under accidental fire from his own side. The manipulation of the Lynch and Tillman stories came back into the news years after the incidents occurred. A persistent campaign to bring the cases before the U.S. Congress saw the Lynch and Tillman families testifying and expressing their dissatisfaction with the Pentagon's use of their stories for political ends.
It is the time for truth, the whole truth, versus hype.
Coming up after the break, yet another recruiting tool, the military war game. Welcome back. People often compare modern warfare to a video game. Technology now allows armies to launch attacks by remote control and watch the results from computer consoles hundreds or even thousands of miles away. And game makers are getting better and better at simulating the sights and sounds of the war zone experience. The gaming shelves of video stores around the world are crammed with titles like Call of Duty, America's Army, and Death from Above, all heavily influenced by contemporary conflict scenarios, often from the Middle East. The Listening Post's Robin Armstrong now on a trend that is putting the graphic reality of war on the computer screens of young people everywhere.
Video games are a modern-day phenomenon. They have earned their place as a permanent fixture on the media landscape, creating a multi-billion-dollar industry. This surge in gaming popularity has produced a subgenre of military-based games that correspond to current global conflicts. Much like the traditional media, these games focus heavily on the wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Lebanon.
U.S. forces begin to close the noose around Saddam, capturing various relatives and associates.
In a way, they have become part of your media. They're part of you telling the story. It's a way of reinforcing facts the way you would like the public to know them. They're not there to present an accurate depiction of reality.
And thanks to the close, some would say too close, links between the military and game designers, players are provided with an authentic, adrenaline-fueled experience.
The main merger between the military and the media industries has really come about through the video game.
On the one hand, the Pentagon looks to the gaming industry for inspiration and software so it can build its training simulators, as well as, more recently, military recruiting video games. And on the other hand, the gaming industry keeps close ties with the Pentagon so it can have access to the latest microchip technology. It can know about the latest weapons specs so that those specs can be included in various war games.
But these games are more than just high-tech forms of entertainment. They also serve a more practical purpose and have become a potent recruitment device for the military, both in the USA and beyond.
The military then understands also that video games are very important for recruitment, allowing them to be downloaded for free at some of the game shows. The military people will admit that these are the best things that they have devised for recruiting young people.
You look like you're really into this. You guys want a real challenge?
Today we're seeing a very interesting phenomenon, is the use of video games for political purposes. And the most interesting example, of course, is a game called America's Army.
First released on Independence Day 2002, America's Army has seen over 20 updated versions to ensure, according to the makers, an authentic representation of combat.
Millions of taxpayer dollars have gone into developing this game. So the game is really selling the U.S. military.
The enemy isn't really ever discussed by name or by country or any kind of specifics, yet the enemy is almost kind of lacking in identity, although given the kind of environments in which the game is staged, it's quite clear that this is a Middle Eastern context.
A context that is fighting back, producing its own military games.
Now, America is not unique. Hezbollah has developed its own video game, and there are games developed by Syrian developers also that are looking into this, and so what they've done is they have video games that are also promoting their side of the story.
In many ways, I think people from Hezbollah, for example, are probably sick and tired of seeing Arab cities being bombed and destroyed in many of these war games. So they offer a very different kind of interpretation. Both Under Siege and Special Force take the perspective of a young Palestinian who decides to join the Intifada. And so they offer a very different kind of set of outcomes.
Hezbollah argues that Hezbollah is combating a trend in the global media, the global entertainment industry, in which Arabs are always the bad guys. And that happens in a lot of video games. It's not just the America's Army video game. In almost every video game that deals with military, there are Arab enemies, there are people with headdresses, and they're kind of shot off randomly.
Even the Arab media itself is considered a legitimate target by the makers of this game, Call of Duty, which depicts an eerily accurate version of Al Jazeera's newsroom as a battle zone for US Marines.
The game spends a lot of time talking about ethics, how to be a good soldier. Killing civilians is not allowed. So, but this is really kind of a smokescreen of exploring the reality of war, of replacing an exploration of what war is really like on the ground.
So what's the long-term impact on the gamers when the games focus little on the ethics of war? How is this mass-market form of entertainment affecting those who go out and fight on the front lines?
Instead of contributing to a greater understanding and greater connection between home front and battlefield, video games in large part contribute to a greater alienation between citizen and soldier.
Our soldiers understanding their time in a military operation as being like in a video game. If you look at many of the media reports from Gulf War II, many US soldiers talk about their experiences as if they were in a movie, but they also talk about their experiences as if they were in the middle of a video game.
The problem with video games in war, nobody dies in the other side of a video game. You battle with the enemy, you get to use the high-tech weapons, but nobody ever really dies. So a video game is a way of preparing for war, training for war, all with death kind of taken out of the equation.
More Global Village voices now and how they see military video games.
In the gaming industry, the effects of this kind of media and these kind of media messages are much more prominent than perhaps even in watching movies, because in a game the player gets to actually simulate and immerse themselves inside the minds and the activities of US military operations internationally.
There's also been an aspect of video games used as an anti-war tool. There's an American professor who used America's Army as the platform for an anti-war protest. He would log into America's Army under the name Dead in Iraq, and he would then actually broadcast the names of real soldiers who had died in Iraq to all of the other players.
Finally, it's not just the U.S. military that has mastered the use of the media to attract new recruits. Militaries all over the world are doing the same thing, and their videos are all over the net. Here's one of our personal favorites. It's from Ukraine, and you do not have to speak the language to get the message. Get yourself a uniform, a gun, jump on an armed personnel carrier, and the girls will surely follow. We're leaving you now with our web video of the week, and we'll see you next time at The Listening Post.
Покатаєш?
На край світу.
А бензину вистачить?
Повний бак.
Коли ж додому?
А ми і так вдома. Ввечері в клубі. Після роботи.
Якої роботи?
Звичайний контракт.
Який контракт? Шлюбний чи що? Військовий. Поки що.
Дівчата! Дівчата! Дівчата!
Час нових героїв. Служба за контрактом у Збройних силах України.